Season 3, Episode 4.
If you're working in technology, you probably are working in a really complex space. And these are tools in which you can just kind of expand your thinking.
Hello everybody, welcome to UX Podcast, coming to you from Stockholm, Sweden. We are your hosts, James Royal Lawson
and Per Axbom.
And balancing business, technology, people and society with listeners all over the world, from Sri Lanka to Ireland.
Sheryl Cababa is an international speaker and workshop facilitator who also helps educate the next generation of human-centered design and engineering students at the University of Washington.
She is also the author of the Rosenfeld Media book, Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers.
And we talked to Sheryl around the time of the launch of the book back in 2022 and published as episode 308.
As is often the case when we re-interview book authors sometime after their books have been released, they often have interesting reflections on their work now that some time has passed. So it's been at least a year and a half since we talked to you in connection with the release of your book, Closing the Loop, beginning of 2023. And I know you've been touring the world since then, doing talks and workshops and spreading the good word about systems thinking. What have you noticed? What have you learned during that period of time since the release of the book, during that tour round?
Yeah, First, nice to be back. Nice to be back on the podcast. And I have to say, one thing I've learned is I somehow had this idea in my mind that I would be done writing the book and I would never have to talk about systems thinking. But now
would be closure. That finishing the book would be a closure point.
Right. And that's really silly idea because, of course, you have to run around talking about the idea and running workshops, which has been great. It's just, it's really interesting. When I finished the book, I was kind of like, oh, that's done. I never have to think about this ever again. I never have to speak about it. And then, of course...
You were trying to get it out of your system.
Yeah, I was getting it out of my system. And then as soon as it was published, of course, the lovely Lou Rosenfeld was like, okay, now you go on a bunch of podcasts and talk about it. So I was like, okay, that's great. I'm ready to talk about it. Because, as you know, post-pandemic, there's been a lot of supply chain problems and what have you. So it took a long time for my book to be published, longer than it normally was pre-pandemic. Instead of something like 6 to 8 weeks, it ended up being 4 months between when I finished the book and when it was published. And I think that break was actually really good because it allowed me the time to kind of like get over it and not talk about it again. And then when the 4 months was up, I was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to kind of discuss what was in the book. And so it's been really great. I've done quite a few conferences, workshops, etc. I talk about it within my consulting work. And yeah, there have been some really interesting things that have jumped out at me, almost like a meta discussion around power and whether designers feel like they have it or not, or strategy and whether designers feel like that's part of their job or not. And the comment I get most frequently, or the question I get most frequently, especially from junior designers or individual contributor designers who are kind of working in their organizations in UX, is, well, how can I don't really know where I can use systems thinking, like these frameworks and things like that you've written about or that you've talked about. I don't know where I can actually use this in my work, because my job is to design some screeny thing. I'm literally focused on one feature for the last year or something along those lines, and I don't feel like there's any opportunity for me to engage in systems thinking. And it made me feel like that how to engage in systems thinking is something I should have written about in the book, because I somehow for me it's never been an issue, and maybe that is because I am fundamentally a design strategist. I'm a design researcher and design strategist, so I find myself in strategic decision making, whether that's the plan or not. And so I didn't perceive that as a problem until after I started going out into the world and talking about it.
So that surprised you.
Yeah. So I think, for example, one of my goals with writing the book was I want a designer to pick up this book, kind of discover some of these very practical frameworks, and then be able to maybe bring it into their work environment as soon as the following week. Like, it should be something you can just do kind of straight out the box. And it was sort of filling a gap for me in terms of how I felt unable to employ systems thinking when I first started using it in my work. I was working in kind of wicked problem spaces like global health, and was feeling like the usual human-centered design tools that I was using were not equipped for these problem spaces that are kind of big and complex and had a lot of stakeholders, had a lot of different power dynamics and incentives. And so that's when I started looking into systems thinking, studying it, and, starting with reading Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, which I still recommend as the primer for systems thinking. But it didn't feel like something you could just take straight into practice and just like, oh, I'm going to run a 1-hour workshop with my team next week and I'm going to use something that is a systems thinking analysis tool. So that's why I write about things like the iceberg model, which is, you look at events and you kind of look at the structures beneath that, the underlying mental models, as well as things like the futures wheel, which helps you understand the primary, secondary, tertiary effects of the kinds of things that you're designing, and you can kind of understand
that strikes me. Both those models strike me as something that you could use even if you're just working with one aspect of your interface.
Yes.
But,
okay.
Yeah, but I just struck me though. Do you think that the problem, the problem with this, or if you're a designer, is it that some people are predisposed with an ability to think in systems, or is it the job role? So I'm trying to ask basically, is it your role that you're in at the moment that is the problem? As in, I'm junior, or I'm working in the same feature as I have done for a year, or is it there's some kind of predisposition that you are a systems person or you're not?
I do think it's a mindset, right? Like, I think this is why in the book I have these little asides kind of throughout it called system spotting, because it's a way of looking at the world. So an example that I often use is, why are there trees in some neighborhoods and not others? And if you were to do an iceberg diagram of that as sort of a problem space or what have you, you would find all of these underlying structures of why that is. There's kind of institutionalized racism that's manifest in infrastructure. It's manifest in the built environment. There's mental models underlying that some people are worth more than others. And it just kind of works its way up into these things that you do see, and you can kind of think about a lot of different problem spaces that way, or just observable things probably have these underlying, kind of motivations, mental models, structure, etc. And I don't think when I started my own journey into systems thinking, I don't think I was necessarily predisposed to think about things that way. I mean, I spent a lot of years as a product designer at Microsoft, at Philips, among other organizations. And really, I can see how somebody can get really narrow in terms of like, I just need to make this thing work. And I need a user who's using this thing in the moment to be able to do whatever it is they need to do. And I'm not thinking about anyone in more than their individual capacity to use a digital app or something like that. The problem with that approach is that there's all of these things that you don't see that are kind of affecting whether your design decisions end up being good in the long term or not, right? And I think, yeah, even if you're just working on a feature and you're working on a feature for a year, I think the problem with having that narrow mindset is that so much of what we're designing now, especially when you're working in digital space, you're working in UX, you're designing stuff that is very likely being used at scale. So if you're designing things for consumers, there might be millions of people who are kind of using whatever it is you're designing. If you're designing things for healthcare systems, there might be millions of people also who are affected by what you're designing, especially if it's, you know, something like an electronic record system. I mean, the most like boring things can have like a huge impact, right? In terms of having an impact even on people who aren't using those products. And then you think about the diversity of the people who are using it and how their experiences might differ. Those are all good reasons to keep systems thinking in the purview of what you're doing. And I mean, I have to say, it felt kind of disappointing that a lot of the response that I was getting was, okay, first I'm impressed by designers' desire to have impact, right? Like, I think especially young designers, there's just a desire to have a positive impact on the world. And so they're really interested in sort of the concepts that I'm thinking about. But oftentimes the struggle or the things that they come to me about, if I've just given a talk and people are waiting to talk to me or something like that, or students reach out to me, also my own students, when I teach, it's the question of, yeah, but you know, like, you're working in the social impact space, so this is just like part of what you do. You're not working at, you know, just like a technology company, kind of designing a feature, designing a screen. Or my friend is working at a technology company and she's been working on one button for 1 year. Like, how is she supposed to incorporate this? Like, these are kinds of the questions I get. And in some ways, I mean, I kind of don't want to say this in a way. I'm like disappointed by their lack of imagination in terms of how they can use different kinds of tools. And I've literally said, like, you can use an iceberg model or futures wheel just to analyze how your organization works, or to work with the decision makers in your organization to understand the things that affect your organization. Like, why is our team having a hard time hiring? Like, I've literally done this with organizations. I had, you know, done a iceberg model about why there's so much attrition in a company. And I think it just, even for the smallest things, it helps you expand your lens. And there might not be something totally actionable that can come out of that, but it's a practiced way of looking at things that where you might be able to eventually identify these other leverage points or something within your ways of working or within your organizational management or something like that, that could have an impact eventually.
Which often leads to innovation because you're learning in more stuff, expanding your lens, understanding how things work outside that button that you're designing.
Yeah,
the context. I mean, you're getting so much context from that mapping exercise to know where you are in the whole space.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and maybe there's a big expectation that however you use these tools is going to be like earth shattering. It's going to like create an avenue for ethics in my company and it's like the expectation doesn't necessarily match what they view as their lack of power in order to kind of make that happen. But it's kind of like, well, I don't know. You can start having those kinds of conversations. Let's say you're concerned about the ethics of your technology company. These are really good, accessible ways to have conversations about your products, right? Like, do a futures wheel on a feature decision that you're making, and you will discover something that could be a positive effect. It could be a negative effect. You might identify new opportunities. And I love that you mentioned innovation, Per, because this is how I kind of sell it to executives as well, or decision makers, is like, oh, if you think like systems analysis is a waste of time, it's not, because you might find points of innovation that you never knew existed before. So are you willing to do that? And it's like, oh yeah, that's like a really promising exercise, and you can do it really quickly. It's going to be an hour with your team.
Well, you say about the ethics, bringing ethics into organizations there. I mean, if these designers are coming to systems thinking, hoping it will lead to a more ethical organization or product or whatever it is. I mean, that in itself is a really good thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
That they've come that far and that they're seeing that this might be a way forward.
Right, yeah. And I think that's not a bad thing. And I think it's just kind of, there's a lens they're using to, I don't know, there's a gap between their expectations and what they think they have the power to do. And I'm kind of like, I don't know. One of the things that I've said before is like, so what you're saying is you don't think you as a practitioner have a seat at the table in terms of this kind of decision making. I've never heard an engineer talk about not having a seat at the table, but I hear designers talk about that all the time. Like, they're always about, do we have a seat at the table? Do we not have a seat at the table? It's like it's a neurosis, like, within our discipline.
You find it's like you want a quick win. I want it to happen quickly.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas change really takes time.
Yes.
I have a theory here about this one.
Okay, let me hear it, because I want to understand it.
With engineers, the developers, right? They're writing the code. If they want to change something, they just change it.
They just change it.
And they just, they get someone to kind of like, check their code. That's what they do. And it's deployed.
They're at the end of the conveyor belt.
Well, no, you're under the surface.
The ingredients.
Under the surface.
Yeah.
Whereas designers, usually it's visual design. I mean, yes, I know we design with words and we design with voice inserts and so on. But there's often a sign-off element to designs. That someone needs to go, tick, yes, you can go forward with that. Whereas with code, with developing, they don't have the same sign off.
I see what you're saying.
The product manager, the manager's not, they're not going to look at the people on the table, around the table. They're not going to want to see, behind the curtain and go, oh no, you've used an if statement there. Oh no, you should be using something else than that. No, that's wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because like there's maybe higher up decision makers, like they don't even want to know what you're doing as an engineer, I guess, because they're just like, wait, I don't even know how to interpret what you're doing. Whereas, you've brought up the example of visual design. Everybody thinks they know how to interpret visual design, right? And so whether they're skilled at it or not. And so, yeah, maybe there is some sort of mindset that you're trained in as a designer that tells you are not empowered to make certain decisions within an organization. But that said, some of my response is a little bit tough cookies. You want change? Then be part of making change. Right?
Yeah, I love what you said about, we really, really want to make an impact, but I'm not going to try anything. Because I hear so many people in the same manner complain about, we don't get to do user research. Wait, why are you asking permission? I thought that was your job. Why are you asking permission for all these things? Go out and do it, because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, being part of design education, I'm like, oh my God, am I training design students to think this way? I'm so disappointed in myself. But I think, and this is a big reason that I've come out of this sort of last year plus of talking about this book with this is one big takeaway is like, oh, I should have really written about the power dynamics in the design practice, because there is a way of talking about this work of just like inserting yourself into sort of strategic decision making by maybe, I don't know, I don't know if this is the right way to describe it, but like Trojan horsing that strategy through these frameworks that seem really simple and really like accessible and maybe feel like fun design exercises. And it's funny that sort of for many people, the first response is like, I don't even know where I can use this. Like you're talking about big problem spaces. You're talking about wicked problems. That's not where I work. But it's like, oh, you do work there. Like you work in a big technology company. You work in a small technology company where you have a diverse subset of users. You are there. You are in a wicked problem space. You just don't know it because digital technology often has these intersections with, you know, different existing systems. I heard, you know, I do a lot of work in ed tech, and I heard one of my stakeholders say the other day, you know, the inequities that are inherent in the education system, those, like, ed tech doesn't solve those inequities. Those inequities upstream need to be solved first in order for ed tech to be equitable. And I thought that was a really good observation because so much of what happens in the technology sector is this kind of problem solving that assumes that this will fix what are actually kind of like big underlying societal problems. And it's like, no, that never happens. There's this book that I'm a big fan of by Justin Reich called Failure to Disrupt. And it's all about how EdTech has failed to do what it says it's going to do over and over and over again. You know, he talks about massive online courses. It was like an obsession in like 2010 or something like that. And it was like, it's going to revolutionize, like, no one's going to be going to college. I think it was Clay Christensen that said colleges are going to be gone by 2025 or 2030 or something. It's like, oh, well, that hasn't happened.
They're saying it now because Khan Academy, of course, is deploying AI.
Yeah, that's right. So like they keep saying this over and over again, but it's like, oh, well, why do these sort of earth-shattering silver bullet technologies not disrupt like the underlying education system? Is because there's all of these incentives, systemic decision makers, bureaucracies, all of the things that when you come in as an outsider to the education system, you're not realizing that all of those things have to be disrupted first before this technology can disrupt something. So what it did instead, if you take the example of massive online courses, what it did instead was reinforce some of the existing power structures. Like those courses were based in places like Harvard, which are elite institutions. And they were like, how are you going to make education equitable through a passive course that's, you know, hosted by Harvard? Like that doesn't make sense that you're trying to make equity changes through an institution like that has like this billions of dollars endowment serving a really limited number of students, and also private, by the way, not, you know, like, so it's not even designed to have an impact on diverse citizens. Anyway, I'm going down this rabbit hole of the domain space in which I work, which is education, because I can talk about it forever as a wicked problem space. But it is a good example of like, if you're working in technology, you probably are working in a really complex space. And these are tools in which you can just kind of expand your thinking. Like, how does policy affect the decisions you're making? A lot of us are maybe some of us have been doing it for a long time, integrating AI into our technology work. Now, there's lots of regulation that's either being proposed or is, you know, kind of being expanded within this space. How can you use systems thinking to kind of understand those dynamics and the potential consequences of that, both positive and negative? So,
and the diversity, equity, inclusion
yes,
aspects of using AI even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and who's developing it and what are their incentives for developing this? Because right now you look at OpenAI and it's just like, well, there's a thing called money, and that kind of drives like their development of this, the way they're engaging with the regulatory environment. Because if this if the big players, it's interesting. The big players want regulation because that locks them in and it makes it harder for others to enter the market. And so it's just like things like that. All of these things can be sort of analyzed with a systems thinking lens. And that helps you kind of think about what does it mean to be designing solutions within these spaces. You don't have to change everything about your organization, but I think just like creating these forms of awareness that we don't usually integrate into our ways of doing things kind of opens the door for that kind of thinking.
So what I'm hearing really is I'm working on this small thing, and I think it doesn't really matter if I apply systems thinking's perspective because I think I know everything. And I think maturing and growing older, I think what I've learned the most is I know less and less and less. So as a designer, as a junior designer, you really should be extremely curious about what do I not know about this problem space? Even though I think it's a tiny thing, what other things do I affect and are affected by the outside world that I'm working on? Because there are so many things. Whatever you're working on, there are so many things. And the tools in your book can help you uncover those things.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping. And I'm not putting like everybody on blast here about like, wow, you guys don't have any imagination whatsoever. It's just a really common question that I get. And, I genuinely, like, I have never actually said tough cookies to anybody. I'm just saying like,
until now,
hey, listen, like there are ways you can use this. Just, it doesn't take that long. Start with trying to do this with your own team, safe space, safe environment, and then see if you can kind of expand it to other teams, other decision makers, and see if like this can kind of help take a more expansive lens, especially as you're making decisions about like what should we design next. I don't know. I hope that people feel less of a barrier around that sort of thing. I just don't like hearing that designers feel small within their organizations, right? Because it's like you have a lot of power. As somebody who's a creative thinker, as somebody who's a critical thinker, a lot of technology companies need critical thinking at this moment in time. And I think designers are really good at bringing that lens to the table, which is why oftentimes when I did a research project, I worked on this tool a few years ago called the Ethical Explorer, and it was for the Omidyar network. And we did research around technology organizations like startups and how they integrate any sort of ethics thinking within their design and development processes. And oftentimes these processes, these initiatives will start with the designers. And there's something about the design practice where when I say this, it's going to sound like other people don't, but designers have a conscience. You know what I mean? Like
it did sound exactly like that.
They kind of have like this built-in conscience, and there's and I think they feel a little bit of like responsibility towards thinking about or trying to have the things that they work on have a positive impact, and also taking that critical thinking lens to it, knowing that there could be unintended consequences to what we're doing. And so I was really pleasantly surprised when I heard that when my team and I were doing that research, was like, oh, a lot of this is starting with designers. That's amazing. And, that was a tool that was explicitly meant for technology teams to use. And so I'm like, we just got to get this in the hands of designers because like they're the ones who are going to be running these workshops. They're going to be having these conversations with their teams. And so I do think like they can play that role. If they feel empowered to play that role, they can play that role. So,
and you must, I suppose you must have as well seen some examples where that has actually happened, because we're talking about some of the complaints, the kind of, sit at the table and so on. But if you just start with designers and you believe that, they can use systems thinking to be that better starting point. Yeah. Have you got any moments where you've picked up on that?
Usually when my team has been brought onto technology organizations to do a little bit of consulting in the space or running workshops or teaching how to do some systems thinking or helping them develop their own tools around ethics. It's come from the designers showing interest and introducing us to those who like hold the purse in the organization. And so I think it's just like, I don't know, making noise in your organization is not a bad thing, right? Especially if you feel like there's a gap in sort of the thinking around things like this. It doesn't mean that you don't believe technology can make a positive difference. It's just you want the technology to be the best that it can be, right? And I think that designers have, many of them anyway, have inherently baked that into what they feel like is their responsibility. But then they feel like, oh, I'm just working on this button. I'm never given the opportunity to do the stuff. And like you were saying, why do you have to be given permission to do that? I think don't wait for the permission. Just do it. I think that's why I was kind of like, yeah, you might not be able to get the budget to do a gigantic causal loop diagram systems thinking project on this entire problem space that lasts, 3 months, but you can run a 1-hour workshop and do a futures wheel. And I think have some prompts with you about ethics, there's many kind of like technology ethics frameworks, for example, and bring those to the table. And I think that's where you kind of start building the momentum for that sort of organizational change, potentially.
I'm sitting now thinking, well, what we're talking about in the realm of design or designers and system thinking, this is a mapping exercise in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I'm really looking forward to you producing
the meta map.
Well, yeah, because we are nowadays, we're not just kind of like one happy little bunch of designers like we were maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Now this is global. The number of designers is into the millions rather than just kind of thousands. So this is a systems problem.
Yeah.
It's a systems issue. And what you're talking about with the strategic influence or kind of just working one little button and things, there are underlying things, forces at play, systems interconnecting systems at play.
Yeah, that's really interesting observation. I do think it deserves some sort of systems mapping exercise of some sort with design leaders. I think there's actually kind of like, I feel like there's a bit of hand-wringing around the design practice in general right now because there's been so much senior leadership that's been laid off in like big technology companies, and it's a little bit searching for like, why is that, when it feels like we had finally gained influence and now maybe there's some concern about whether we as a practice are able to show our value enough to continue kind of having that quote unquote seat at the table. And yeah, I don't know, maybe there's definitely a connection to design education, and how we're a lot of design education, I think, involves teaching us how to produce and engage in sort of tactical decision making and like the use of tools. I used to joke in one of my previous organizations, I sat on the research and strategy team. But I was also, because my background is as a UX designer, I also sat in on the UX team sort of meetings. And it was funny, like the research and strategy team meetings, we would always be kind of talking about, in some ways, like philosophical approaches to design. Like, so having some of these conversations about ethics and what have you, as well as like, what are some methods like within design research that can better inform strategy and things like that. When I would attend the UX design meetings, it was always about like, what's the latest tool? Are we all using Figma now? What's going on? Have you guys like tried this other tool? And I'm just like, why are we always talking about tools here? Like, there is something there's so many other things to talk about in terms of advancing the practice, but it felt like it ended up being like, what are we using to prototype now? And it was, I don't know, it felt really limiting. And I didn't think it needed to be as limiting as it was. And so there was a point where I was kind of like, you guys, we need to bring like topics to the table that are not just around like, here's one person on the team who's tried this new tool and they're going to show you how to use it. It's like, oh my God, you guys meet like as a full team once a month. And it's always about what tool are we not using anymore and what tool are we using now. So there is something in design education that's steering us in that direction that needs to be resolved, I think.
Yes. So bring a new topic to the table to your next meeting. I think that's an excellent suggestion to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sheryl.
Thank you for having me back. I feel like I just went on like a 30-minute rant, and I feel a little bit bad about it because I'm kind of like, I'm not blame. I think you're right, James. It's like, it is a systems thinking problem. And when I talk about systems, I don't, okay, so at the end of the book, I say, don't blame the lettuce, which is it's a quote. Oh my gosh, why is his name escaping me? The famous monk, Thich Nhat. Okay, sorry, I apologize, but he says, don't blame the lettuce. It's not the lettuce's fault if it doesn't thrive. It's the system around it, right? It's like, is it getting enough soil, or is the soil? Is it getting enough water? Is it in good soil? Is it getting enough sun? Like, how do you help the lettuce thrive? And so maybe we can think about our design practice in that way. It's like, oh, our young design practitioners, they're the lettuce. And it's not their fault if, like, this is a limited purview. It's the fault of all of the rest of us who are in charge of this practice, whether we're design educators or design leaders or what have you. How do we help the lettuce thrive? And I feel like this is, something that's like the whole responsibility of a design practice, and it's just been eye-opening to me. And it doesn't make me blame them. It makes me a little sad that that's like talented people coming out of design school, and sometimes this is their perspective. It's like, I don't have power in my organization to make change. So yeah, we need to change everything. Like, make change now.
I think it's
design leaders.
Definitely a systems problem.
Yes.
Definitely.
I'll be looking for that map from you.
Oh, it's me doing it now. Damn it,
You suggested it.
Yeah.
So now it's your responsibility.
I was expecting you to come, the third interview with you would be you presenting the results of your research.
You can present it to me, and then we'll analyze. Yeah,
we'll put the map in the show notes when James is done with it.
That's right.
All right, thanks. That's my summer gone.
That's what you get for bringing it up.
So I'd completely forgotten how much I got bullied into producing a systems map towards the end of our conversation there.
Well, bullied, maybe not bullied you. Actually, it was your suggestion.
It was my suggestion, but I was kind of thinking that the systems, the systems thinking expert will be the one that picked up on that and thought, yes, I'll do that and I'll deliver it to you pronto.
But as a teacher, of course, she wants the student to do it, and then she will reflect back on their work.
Yeah, I know. I realised that listening back that she was encouraging me, was Sheryl.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have to say that I'd actually completely forgot about my homework. As completely classic student I am there, I got given the homework and then abruptly completely forgot about it. And listening back now, I realised about it. So I did actually start to map out this. I say this. So what I did was I took I started at a starting point of an individual digital designer. And thought, okay, I'll map out from there a little bit. So I got as far as like mapping out. There's tools, technologies. There's your professional network of the design community. You've got your clients, projects, or employers, and then your education, but also your future education. So continuous learning, skills.
That makes sense.
And then I have branding, your own branding or website, or I mean, you may even say portfolio. And the market or industry you operate in, public sector, private sector, and various parts of that. So there's quite quickly got quite a lot of components. In a map, and also quite quickly start to realize that, of course, there's feedback loops, bidirectional feedback loops. But the thing I've thought about, I started to focus on really quite quickly, was the one to do with tools and clients or organizations that you often, it was in job ads or even requests for projects and so on, it will list tools. So when it comes to
classic.
That feedback loop, but that made me feel that that feedback loop was quite a strong one towards tools. I mean, there was clearly an amplification going on there that tools will be really quite important. And if you look at other parts of it, I said for example, the design community, or feedback about the work you've produced. So rather than what you've done, it's like how you've done it.
Exactly.
It was less tangible, and as a result of that, I suppose weaker. It just didn't feel like that got amplified and boosted in the same way as the focus on tools did.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I mean, because we have this discussion a lot about how focused designers are on tools, and they are, of course, because it's expected of them, or at least people expect to be asked to work with these tools at their next place of employment, and they want to excel at them. They want to be better than other people at them, because that's how they compare themselves with others. So it becomes a core part. And now as I'm saying this, I'm actually thinking, so how do I take that knowledge and apply it? If I want people to work more on systems thinking, then can I do something similar to what Miro and Mural do, where they integrate templates? So maybe if the iceberg model was part of the tool I'm using, so it's actually integrated into there to remind me to look at the bigger picture, making use of the insight you uncovered when making your map, right? Yeah.
I think this is already what I've seen just from doing a quick bit of systems thinking, system mapping. Then I'm getting the feeling that I can't beat the tools. The tools are such an important component of our world as digital designers that exactly what you're saying now, I've got to then work out how can I amplify other feedback loops in this diagram to impact on the tools
exactly
without it being in a way that's compatible with that feedback loop. Because I'm not going to be able to go into an organization and, we mentioned in the interview, change takes time, and you can't go in there and like rip out some kind of design process. You can't just kind of say, no, we're not using Figma anymore. Like, just like that. It's going to be too aggressive, too much damage to the system in one go. So it's not going to accept it.
At the same time, the more of a senior designer you become, the more comfortable you feel working without even touching the tools. So alongside the integration of these tools into the current workflow, you also need to build that confidence and that curiosity and that way of working that is more strategic, I suppose.
Yes, and that's the supporting structures aspect of this, isn't it? That as a senior designer who feels confident without the scaffolding of the tools, it's then your responsibility to boost the younger designers in their confidence and skills around these tools. So maybe is this about conversations that we need to keep lifting the actual thing we're doing when we're using a tool to do it. Yeah, I love this because you just did this an hour ago. I know, or less than an hour ago even. Yeah.
And already we're thinking about, well, how What are the types of solutions? So this is an example of how we can apply Sheryl's advice and tools to a defined topic area quite quickly.
Yes, this. We don't need to solve this. This is not. In fact, in some ways, this is a wicked problem. I don't think we will be able to solve it directly like that. But we've actually managed to do, I guess, exactly what Sheryl asked. We've applied this.
No, exactly.
Or hoped, rather. We've applied this really quickly, quite simply to something quite complex.
Yeah.
And it's got me and you working on creative. We're being creative now. We're thinking about ways we can manipulate this system and adjust it and impact it. And that's wonderful. Like you say, this has not taken as much effort to get here.
And it's so much easier than if we just started with a blank paper and tried to talk about it without having that structure that the tool provides. Or
I think it's more, this feels easier to grapple than if you just start out with a straight problem statement.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and you see how it's helping you see the right problems instead of assuming that you know what the problem is.
Well, I've got a different lens to look at the problems through. When I've got this simple systems map of an individual digital designer, I can then appreciate the how do I apply systems thinking in my role problem better.
Yeah, absolutely lovely.
Wow. Wasn't expecting that. But I kind of was. I don't know.
Just do it.
Exactly, Pat. And that's I think, to wrap up this little bit there, I was thinking back to some of the times, years ago, in the very beginning of the lifetime of this podcast. We're going back a few years now, like maybe 14 years or so. Then we did a lot of this guerrilla stuff, or kind of just do it stuff. We some of our first interviews we did guerrilla at conferences. We didn't get invited to conferences. We just turned up and recorded interviews anyway.
Yes, very true.
I mean, we did user research by going out into the street and asking people. I mean, all this kind of stuff. You just didn't ask permission. You just did it.
Exactly.
Maybe we just do need to do it.
Definitely. And as per usual, you found some recommended listening for us, didn't you, James?
I did. In the intro, we already mentioned one of them, which is, of course, our first interview with Sheryl about her book, which I said is episode 308. And that's a really good one to listen to. On top of that, though, I'm going to give you a second one. And that's episode 242, even further back. That's Figure It Out with Stephen Anderson and Carl Fast. Which, again, the whole thing with thinking and thinking about thinking, Stephen and Carl do a lot of that in that book.
Yeah, excellent. I've completely forgotten about that one. We don't do a lot of the two people interviews.
Pick it up and read it again, Per. It's really good.
Okay, looking forward to looking at more of your meta systems map, James. We'll put the map in. Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
So, James, I just downloaded this VR app to simulate the Titanic.
All right, a VR app to simulate the Titanic?
Yeah, but I can't use it. It's still sinking.